I will be reading Isaiah 61 to 6, and I'm reading from the New Revised Standard Version. Arise, shine, for your light has come, and the glory of the Lord has risen upon you. For darkness shall cover the earth, and thick darkness the peoples. But the Lord will rise upon you, and his glory will appear over you. Nations shall come to your light, and kings to the brightness of your dawn. Lift up your eyes and look around. They all gather together, they come to you. Your sons shall come from far away, and your daughters shall be carried on their nurses' arms. Then you shall see and be radiant. Your heart shall thrill and rejoice, because the abundance of the sea shall be brought to you. The wealth of the nations shall come to you. A multitude of camels shall cover you, the young camels of Midian and Ephah. All those from Sheba shall come. They shall bring gold and frankincense, and shall proclaim and praise of the Lord.
It was a gray, rainy day as I boarded a plane for a scheduled trip. I felt uneasy, wondering if this was really a good day to fly due to the predicted storms. But we took off and headed up in the cloud-covered sky. For several anxious minutes, we were lost in a dark, clouded world. But suddenly, the plane burst through the clouded darkness into the most brilliant world of light. It was breathtaking. The sun was shining like nothing I could have imagined in a vast universe with white, fluffy clouds for a floor and bright blue sky and glorious light. Light breaking out vividly over the thick darkness below. The people to whom the prophet Isaiah was speaking in our text today were indeed living in a dark and clouded world. Recall with me on our first Sunday of Advent that the people of Judah were in fear of being overtaken by the large Babylonian Empire. So after many intervening years, now this group of people from Judah had been taken into exile. They were refugees, away from their homes and their life as they had known it. Things were dark, with little left to give them hope. They were exiled from their land and far away from their homes. And the city of Jerusalem and the temple were in ruins. They could no longer worship and sing as they once had in their beloved temple, the place where they had encountered God. The dynasty of David had come to a disastrous end. They were a community without land, without a temple, without a leader, struggling in darkness. They had heard, however, that perhaps King Cyrus of Persia would allow them to return to their land, and they were waiting for the word that they would be able to return to Jerusalem from their Babylonian exile. They held a small glimmer of hope to return from their world of darkness. The darkness of our world also seems to be thick and pervasive as people struggle to find hope in the midst of the grim realities of life. We think of the million of exiles and refugees in our world today, people who have had to leave their land and homes and have journeyed many miles, crossing borders, seeking a safe place, a secure place from the turmoils of war and violence, away from their thick darkness, hoping to return someplace to which they called home. Other refugees leave their homes and lands not wanting to leave their familiar places and their families, but desperate to find a way out of their economic darkness. There's no work for them to do in order to feed their families, so they journey to a place that they think offers hope for a better life. Still others experience darkness in their struggle of living in places where they cry out for liberation and beg for basic human rights, but do not find them. The powerful rule with no regard for the weak and powerless. Some people also find themselves living in darkness in their personal lives as they are weighed down by the burdens and difficulties for which there seem to be no answers. It indeed seems, as the prophet Isaiah says, darkness has covered the earth and thick darkness the people. But the prophet Isaiah pierces the gloom of darkness with a brilliant light, a vision of God's glory transforming the world, a promise that God will restore God's people to contentment and calls all people to come home. Having just declared in the previous chapter that God is coming as Redeemer, the prophet Isaiah now commands the people to arise, shine, for your light has come. And the light is the glory of the Lord. God's presence is with them, bursting into the darkness, showering them with light. God is the source of their renewed vitality. The community of God's people now shimmers with light. It's brilliant and it is radiant. Those who have been scattered, their sons and daughters of the next generation, will also come to the light. As God's light transforms the people of Israel, it also transforms the whole world. Nations and kings stream to this magnificent light. The prophet implores the Israelites to lift up your eyes and look around you, to witness this unexpected homecoming and the gathering of people from all over the world. It is a time to be thrilled and to rejoice. A new day has arrived. God's beacon of light has pierced the darkness. God's vision of hope for God's people has arrived. The prophet Isaiah's words at the beginning of Advent also asked the people of God to envision a world where all nations and people would stream to the mountain of the Lord, and on this mountain everyone would learn the ways of God's heart, which included beating their swords into plowshares. A transformation so that all people can walk in the light as we have been learning to do. And today's passage from Isaiah echoes that earlier text and asks again us as the people of God to envision something different despite our circumstances. To see God's transformative light coming just over the horizon and to reorient ourselves to see a different future where God's glory is made manifest among them so that the nations and kings can be drawn to this light. And we have just celebrated the light of God's glory revealed in the birth of Jesus. We have rejoiced in God's coming and dwelling here on earth in the mystery of the incarnation. God's light has pierced the darkness. We celebrated Jesus' birth at our Christmas Eve service with the theme of light, that Jesus is the light. Now, we often read this text from Isaiah 60, assuming that the "you" in it refers to the Christ child, this child whom the Magi have come to adore, drawn by the light of the star. In Jesus, the glory of the Lord has risen. His light is the one to which all nations shall come. Jesus certainly came to bring God's light to our world. At the same time, however, if we look closely at the "you" in this passage, it becomes clear that the "you" actually refers to Zion, the holy city of Jerusalem. Now, Zion in the Old Testament was a symbol of where God was present among God's people. It's a symbol of God's presence. So the prophet Isaiah is imagining God's glory being complete as God's people become the light of God's presence. The Lord will arise upon you, people of God, and God's glory will appear over you as a community, as a church of God's people. Then you, the people of God, shall be radiant, and your heart shall thrill and rejoice. The Jewish Study Bible translates verse 5 as you behold, you will glow. Your heart will throb and thrill. As the people of God live in God's presence, they will glow and draw others to this radiance and to God's vision, where all nations will gather together, drawn by the glowing of God's people. It's to this that we are called as a community of God's people, to glow with God's light because God is present among us. Arise, shine, for your light has come. God is among us, and as we dwell in God's presence, we will reflect God's glory to the world. Rejoice and glow with God's light. For we as a church, we are God's instrument to show God's presence and glory to the world, which is shrouded in darkness of war and violence, hatred, apathy, poverty, and despair. We are the ones called to use our imaginations to see what is not yet, and yet to act as though it were already true. We, the church, are to arise and shine to offer light and healing and reconciliation to our world. We, the church, are to glow in the radiance of God so that all people and nations will be drawn into God's presence. Rejoice, church. Rejoice in God's presence and be radiant. Our radiance as a church body is essential to the bright future that God is imagining, that God is providing this vision for. And this is really a huge assignment for us. And for me, as I think I'm kind of a task-oriented person, my nature is to encourage us then to make a big, long list. Make a list in order to accomplish this goal. And isn't this the perfect time of year? Because we're starting out our new year with New Year's resolutions. And so there are many things that we could put on a list to radiate, ways that we can radiate God's light. Take a meal to a needy neighbor. Volunteer to go on an MDS trip. Write a letter to our representative about our views on helping immigrants. Make something for the MCC sale, and we could go on and make a fairly long list. And doing all these things could be seen as us offering our gifts in the same way that the wise ones offered precious gifts to Jesus. These are the ways that we can make our light shine brighter in the world, right? We should make this list. No doubt these are all good things, and we indeed may choose to do many of these. However, it's so easy to get so busy doing and serving that we forget that first we need to be. We need to be in the presence of God to be radiant. In order to glow with God's light, we must first make a habit of being in the presence of God. We cannot shine on our own. We need to reflect God's light. We cannot be radiant unless we spend time basking in God's light and presence. In the story of the Magi, we often focus in on the gifts that were brought to the baby Jesus. Yet in taking a closer look, we see that the gifts were really secondary. Matthew says that when they saw that the star had stopped, first of all, they were overwhelmed with joy. They rejoiced because they found the place where the child was. Then on entering the house, they saw the child with Mary, his mother, and they knelt down and paid him homage. They didn't come in immediately and present their gifts. No, they came into his presence, kneeled down in reverence. Their first act was an act of worship. First homage, first worship, first giving themselves utterly and completely to Christ. First, being in God's presence. Last January, I went on a trip to Egypt with other students and friends of our seminary in Elkhart AMBS. One place we visited was St. Macarius' monastery, a monastery of the Coptic Christian Church that was established in the 4th century and still continues today. It is named after St. Macarius, a man who withdrew from normal life in the city and went to a desert area in Egypt and lived for a time in solitude in a desert cave in his quest to live in God's presence. Later, others followed him into the desert, and eventually his followers gathered around him to live in a community together, and over the centuries, this monastery continues. In the monastic tradition, those who join the monastery withdraw to spend time alone in God's presence, seeking a deeper relationship with God. The monks who live in this monastery today establish a rhythm of life around practices and exercises such as prayer, worship, and work that are helpful in opening themselves to being in God's presence. They are learning to see God's presence at the center of their lives in the desert and find clarity for their lives within their community and their relationship to the world around them. They spend time in solitude. They spend time in worship together, and each of them also has a job to do. The monastery operates a large farm growing fruits, vegetables, and meat, which helps feed those in need in the larger society. As well, the people from around the world come to the monastery for times of retreat to be refreshed and renewed by experiencing God's presence. This monastic community is learning to find joy and learning to glow with God's glory as they live in God's presence, which gives them evidence that God is indeed at work, that God's reign is being established in that part of the world. Now, I'm not suggesting that we go and join a monastery or that we even try to become some kind of monastic community. I am suggesting that we make it a priority this year to be in God's presence, that we set aside time within our busy schedules to withdraw, to be in God's presence, that we make worship a priority, just as the wise men did. We can do this individually as we put into practice regular spiritual disciplines, but we can also do this corporately as our church body. In community, as we worship together, we spend time with God and each other. In this way, we place ourselves in God's presence by a regular gathering together in this place in worship each week, expecting to be changed by being here. Rejoicing in being together, rejoicing in taking time to be in God's presence, to absorb the light of God into our own lives. Worship will transform us as Christ's body so that together we will radiate God's light to the world. Together we will glow with God's glory. May we rejoice and be radiant, for God is in our midst. Amen.